Welcome back to AP U.S. History. This is Chapter 20. We're talking about American imperialism, uh, why we felt we needed to expand overseas, how we treated people, what were some of the possessions that we'll acquire. We're also going to talk about the Spanish-American War as being uh, a, a an outcome of this imperialism. We had just talked about acquiring Hawaiian Islands. Cleveland wasn't interested in acquiring it. He was roundly considered or criticized for this move. Eventually, when McKinley becomes president, he will move quickly to bring the Hawaiian Islands into the fold of the Americans because he feels that some other European power might take it over. And so the Hawaiian Islands will, from that point on, be a territory of the United States and later a state. Cuba was certainly a important uh, issue during this time of American imperialism. Cuba was controlled by the Spanish and had been since the early days of the conquistadors. Um, the Spanish rulers, administrators, treated the Cubans very harshly. Um, the insurrections were dealt severely with. People were rounded up and put into concentration camps, about 100,000. Um, Whaler was sometimes called the butcher whaler by the U.S. Because so many Cubans were starved to death and beaten and killed. Uh, Cleveland, when he was president, refused to intervene. He said the U.S. would stay neutral and didn't want to get involved. McKinley, when he becomes president, is going to have some stronger words against Spain and tells them that they have to clean up their act and start treating the Cuban people better. One of the things that helped spur on the Spanish-American War between America and Spain is yellow journalism. Pulitzer and Randolph Hearst sometimes fabricated stories about atrocities in Cuba, trying to get Americans worked up to a fighting frenzy. And they were somewhat successful in doing that. Hearst once told Frederick Remington, "You finish the pictures and I'll furnish the war." And said he would certainly make it up. Yellow journalism sold papers because people wanted to find out about atrocities in the world. And there was a lot of cartoons and stories about Spanish misrule in Cuba and the fact that America should do something about that. Here are some of the pictures of the concentration victims. Many Cubans died because of maltreatment. In 1897, McKinley came close to delivering an ultimatum for war. Because of pressure, U.S. Spain will end the concentration and Whaler will be removed. And it looks like war might be avoided. Immediately, the Cubans revolt, and when a lot of these people are released from these camps, um, because of the political unrest, U.S. sends the battleship Maine to Cuba to on a friendly visit and also to show of support for anyone wanting to evacuate Cuba, Americans. The Delhomme letter is something that was intercepted by Hearst and then later published in his paper. And it roundly criticized McKinley and pretty much told the American public that they had no uh, uh, intent of honoring any agreement with the United States government. He was the ambassador to the U.S. He said that McKinley was weak and a bitter of admiration of the crowd. He was just another would-be politician, and that the fact is that they were not going to pay too much attention to the Americans. And this letter gets published in the American newspaper, and people get a little worked up about it. Also said that the McKinley presidency was corrupt. and that they were going to do whatever they wanted to do with Cuba. Uh, in February 15th, 1898, the battleship Maine is moored in the port of Havana, and it explodes. And it was apparently an internal problem. They had a boiler blew up, sank the ship, killed quite a few Americans. Some Americans blamed the Spanish, saying that they had sabotaged the ship. And Americans now cry for war. Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. Well, actually, Spain had nothing to do with blowing up the ship, but all things considered, why not blame the Spanish? And so we don't like the Spanish anyway because of their mistreatment of the Cubans. And so to avert war, Spain agreed to any terms that the Americans might put on her. The Spanish government really is in the New World is just a shell of what it had been. McKinley really wasn't eager, nor was Wall Street, for war because they thought it might interfere with trade with Cuba. So McKinley didn't see Cubans' independence in long-term interests of Americans. But these newspaper articles just kept whipping up the frenzy for war. Eventually, McKinley, because of political pressure from the public, will declare war on Spain. Before we declare war on Spain, the Teller Amendment is passed by Congress that says we have no designs of annexing Cuba into the American territory. Remember back, the Confederates or the people in the South were hoping through the Olmstead Manifesto to possess Cuba and make it another state. Well, we want to tell everyone that we're fighting for the Cubans, and we have no designs on Cuba after the war. This is supposed to make us look good in the eyes of the world, and so we were looking for international support. Admiral Dewey will win a victory in Manila Bay in the Philippines, and he will be aided by a Filipino commander, Emilio Aguinaldo, and later we will go back on what we promised him in the Philippines, and there will be insurrection there against the Americans. The U.S. invades Cuba and Puerto Rico. They go to Hidalgo Harbor, and they destroy the Spanish fleet. This is where Teddy Roosevelt makes a name for himself as a Rough Rider, and charges up San Juan Hill. This shows the American fleet sailing from Hong Kong, and some called it that splendid little war, which didn't cause too much casualties, but certainly Americans will reap a lot of benefits from this war. And as we kick out Spain, the Philippines are going to be our possession, as will Cuba fall under our influence in other places. Here's Dewey capturing Manila and smashing the Spanish fleet. We had a much superior navy to the Spanish, and we take them out quickly. Again, this splendid little war. This was a term characterized by Teddy Roosevelt. And this war is a short-lived war. How prepared was U.S. for war? Well, probably if we'd have gone against a real serious contender, maybe not. This shows the Rough Riders, and you can see Teddy Roosevelt right in the middle there on the left, and leading the charge up San Juan Hill. And this makes a name for himself, and it's going to put him into the presidency after McKinley died in office, and he's going to be reelected in his own right. The Treaty of Paris, it seems like there's a lot of treaties of Paris in 1898. End of the Spanish-American War. Cuba is free. U.S. received Pacific Islands of Guam, Puerto Rico, and we still have those two territories. Americans, like we always do, seem to like to pay people off. So we said, hey, how about $20 million for the Philippines? And the Spanish government, being in no position to bargain, said, okay. One of the things is that we were afraid the Philippines might fall into the hands of the Germans. They seem to be a rival in the Pacific. The issue of Filipino independence can be settled later, according to McKinley. Now, imperialism versus anti-imperialism debate rages on. This is going to bring this to a head. The expansionists urged that the Philippines and Hawaiians were necessary with trade with China, so we had to expand overseas. Besides, we needed to send Protestant missionaries to convert those poor Catholic Filipinos. Businessmen in America were eager to open up trade with the Philippines and other places. We were seeking raw materials to manufacture in the U.S. McKinley later said that a little voice told him that to take the Philippines to Christianize and civilize. And so Waldo is, we're going to go back on a word with him, and he's going to fight the Americans for a few years and eventually be destroyed. He is considered a national hero in the Philippines, and they commemorate him like we commemorate the presidents in the United States. The anti-imperialist argument said, no, we really don't want to have domestic possessions overseas. People like William Jennings Bryan said that foreign issues might overshadow domestic issues. We might be too caught up in overseas politics and not concentrate on our own business. Some fear that foreign workers would come into the United States from these places and lower the wages. Others fear that American factories would be located overseas. And that comes true later on in the 20th century. Colonies require a standing army, and it would require young men to go over and serve there, and they'd be in danger, and it would create higher taxes. Some feared that there would be a mixing of the race who send young boys overseas, and they're liable to marry Filipino girls, or Cubans, or Puerto Rican girls, and this might dilute the white race. So, the Anti-Imperialist League was founded in 1899. Some notable people who were against overseas possession: Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie, remember him, he was American U.S. Steel, William Jennings Bryan, among some of the leaders, and they campaigned against annexation of the Philippines and other acts of imperialism. Now, the dilemma: did the U.S. citizenship follow the flag? Just because we had a flag over the Philippines, was that going to mean are they American citizens? And we're going to stop here and pick this up.